Welcome to the FemiNinja Project. I am your host, Cheryl I Love, middle-aged ninja hiding in plain sight, dedicated to restoring human dignity one person at a time and helping you unleash your personal power. Discover that it's possible to look like a woman, act like a lady, move like a ninja, and think like a warrior. And remember, men are always welcome on the FemiNinja Project. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the FemiNinja Project, and thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. We have the most amazing guest to talk to today. I mean, she's got quite the story. She is, according to myself, the most courageous woman I have ever met, and you will find out why when you hear her story. Her name is Sandy Phillips Kirkham. She is a wife, mother, grandmother. She's a speaker, an advocate, and author of the award-winning book, Let Me Pray Upon You, Breaking Free from a Minister's Sexual Abuse, which documents her story from innocent 16-year-old victim to survivor and advocate. Wow, Sandy, thank you so much for being on the show and welcome.
Well, thank you for I enjoy being here. Thank you.
I did read your book, and you can even see it over my shoulder. And I mean, I just rode that roller coaster ride with you. It's an amazing story. So I'm just going to turn it over to you and have you tell your story.
Okay. I think it's important to start with how involved I was in my church and how important church life was to me. I began attending when I was about 8. My family didn't go to church, but I went with my friend who lived up the street. And from the very beginning, it was a place I really enjoyed being. I felt connected there. My parents were divorced. I didn't see my father much. And so the church became like my second family. And it was a place that I felt secure. As I got older, I began to teach Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I was baptized when I was 13, and my faith began growing after that. It was everything important to me was surrounded by church in my life. I think it'd be no stretch of the imagination to say that the doors were open, I was there. So shortly after I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor. Everyone was excited that this new charismatic youth pastor was coming to our church because they had seen the growth that he had created in his church prior to coming to our church. He was different than any pastor we'd ever really had before. He was 30 and he was married with 2 children, but he dressed like we did. He wore cutoff jeans. He had sideburns. He drove a orange convertible. I think, in the 70s vernacular, he was just hip, and he knew our music. He knew sports. He was just a different kind of person in our church that we'd ever seen before. So, and with him, he brought some great ideas, and our church began to grow. The youth group was expanding. Everything that he did seemed like it was golden. He was almost treated like a rock star in many ways. And I was very active in the church. I was one of the leaders. And so it wasn't surprising that he tapped into me as one of the core leaders. And he began to start spending more time with me under the guise that we were helping the church and that we were helping the church grow. So one night after a youth group meeting, he waited for everyone to leave. It was at my home. And once everyone was gone, he began to tell me how wonderful I was and how much he appreciated all the work I had been doing in the church. And then he started to caress my face, and he bent down and he kissed me. And at that moment, I was stunned. I thought, I think he just kissed me. But my next immediate thought was, well, this is my pastor, and he wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. And so I just rationalized it, that this was his way of showing his appreciation and that I've misunderstood. I babysat for the family. His wife worked evenings. So this gave him the perfect opportunity to then spend more time with me and to start this grooming process. And so I would spend evenings with him, and he would talk about the Bible. We'd talk about how we could make the church better. He would give me books to read on spirituality. And I saw all this as a good thing, that he was really cared about me. And this was his way of showing me how much he did care. But the kissing began to become more frequent. Sometimes he was hugging me longer. It was just a slow process. And that continued for about a year until he got to his ultimate goal of having sex with me, which he did. And that changed everything because I couldn't rationalize that. At 16, I knew that was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, he made it very clear that I should not tell anyone and no one was going to believe me, and that he needed me in the ministry, that this was God's will, and that together we were working for the church. And, in my state of confusion and my need to be wanted his attention, I still wanted that attention. I didn't know how to respond. And so I just felt like I needed to do whatever he was asking me to do. And that included having sex with him when he wanted it.
I do have a question for you. Did he ever use the word love in the grooming process?
Well, the interesting thing is when he came to the church, he was very big on telling people, I love you, and hugging people. So this was kind of a natural thing. So many times throughout, not just with me, he would say, I love you, and I love you. And we would even have these circles, he would call them, these love circles, where we would sit in a circle and each person would tell another person why they loved them. So he had blurred the lines of that terminology early on. So when he would say he loved me, I just assumed it was like he meant with everyone else. Until that night, then he was beginning to say it in a way that meant he loved me in a sexual way. And interestingly enough, as I was writing the book, I would write things like he would say to me, I love you. And then something, I love you. And I finally stopped and thought to him, and I said, I wonder if he ever said he loved me, because after that, he was basically trying to gaslight me and tell me, I love you, even though his actions weren't just in a way that showed he loved me. He was physically abusive. And so his actions didn't quite fit with how he truly would treat someone if they loved you. It was an abusive relationship.
Mm-hmm. Now, he was transferred from another church. And this
Correct.
this is the part of the story where my head wants to explode.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that. Why he was transferred from this other church to yours?
Well, I think initially he was transferred. He was hired without knowledge that this had occurred once before. It was after he was hired at our church, shortly, maybe a month later, a young woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexual inappropriate behavior. 2 elders and the senior minister at the time confronted him. He said it was true, said he was sorry. It was a mistake. He would never do it again, and he apologized. And so the elders and the senior minister decided to let it go. No information was given to the congregation, and he was allowed to continue as our youth pastor. It would be 6 months after that accusation that he was kissing me in my hallway. So this wasn't his first incident of sexual misconduct.
Mm-hmm. So it still just absolutely blows my mind. And when you said, you didn't really know how to respond or how to handle all of that, what 16-year-old would know how to handle a situation like that? This is a 30-year-old married man with 2 kids. He's
and
your
the pastor,
position of authority. So tell us then at this point how that relationship was starting to affect your own personal life, your school life. You're still in high school,
right.
You're obviously not dating anybody else, or even your relationship with the church, and even your faith relationship at that point, because here you are mired in all of this confusion.
Right.
And who did you go to? Who could you talk to?
Well, there's a lot there, so let me see if I can back it up a little bit. So yes, once the relationship became sexual, he became a totally different person. He became physically abusive. He was controlling my life in every aspect, what I was to wear, who I could see, who I could date. He started to isolate me from my friends, which is typical of abusers. They need to have you isolated for fear you're going to tell someone. It affected my spiritual life in a way that I began then pulling away from God, because again, the guilt and the shame that I felt like I was participating in this, that, I wasn't just a victim here. I was agreeing to this, even though in reality I wasn't. So that began to affect my spiritual life. I felt like an imposter, because at this time I'm still involved in the church, but I felt like if people really knew who I was and what I was doing, that I was having sex with the minister, they would think poorly of me and that they would not really know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big issue for me. The guilt was huge for me. And there were 2 times I went to him, just begging him to stop. And that I said, I couldn't keep doing this, that, I couldn't go on like this. And he would respond in one of 2 ways. One, he would say how much he needed me, how much he loved me. He played on the guilt that this was something I needed to do, that was God's will, that we were married in God's eyes. That's what he told me many times, that we were married in God's eyes. Or the other way he would react was to become angry. He would push me up against the wall and say, you're never going to be able to leave me. Don't ever think you can leave me. No one's going to love you because you're not a virgin any longer. And of course, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, he's right. Who would love me? I'm used. I'm not worth anything any longer. So the ability to leave that relationship was almost impossible for me. And I felt like I was in a black hole with no way out. And while the church was surrounded by people that cared about me, there wasn't anyone I felt like I could tell. Because first of all, I knew they loved him and everyone thought he was wonderful. And so how was I going to destroy their dreams? And I knew what a bombshell this would be if I were to tell anyone. And so that also kept me quiet, along with his threats.
Mm-hmm. So when did it come out?
So the relationship continued for 5 years.
Oh.
It went on for 5 years. And it was, I at one point, I would say probably 2 years in, just decided that this was my life. I quit trying to get out of the relationship. I didn't see any way out. And I tell people, a trap is so well, if a trap is good, even though there's a way out, you can't see it, it doesn't matter. And I could not see a way out. And so I think 2 years into the relationship, I just decided I'm going to have to figure out how to be happy in this, because this is going to be my life. This won't be over till he says it's over. And I didn't see an indication that he was going to let it be over.
Oh.
So it went on for 5 years. I think his wife was becoming suspicious. And then eventually 2 people from the church were suspicious of the behavior and the attention that he was giving to me. And they followed him one night and found us in a hotel room. And that was the beginning of the end of that relationship, in the sense that he was called in by the elders. He was given his version of the story of what was going on. One of the things that he told me was that if the elders call me, I'm to tell them that it had only been going on for a year. I think he did that for 2 reasons. One, I don't think he obviously wanted people to know how young I was when this started, because at this point I'm now 21. So it's much easier to accept that this could have been a 20-year-old and a 34 or 5-year-old than a 16-year-old. The second reason I think he wanted to let people believe that it was only for a year was that if he said it had been going on for 5 years, that meant from the moment he walked into that door of those churches, he was having this relationship with me for 5 years, the entire time he was their pastor. And that would be harder to forgive him for than if it was just a mistake that had happened and it was only on for a year. I think that's why his reasoning behind that was. But the point I want to make here is that the elders listened to whatever he was saying. I was never called in. No one ever asked me any questions. I was told where to sit in church, how to behave. I was told not to tell my parents. It was all in an effort to protect him and his family, to get him to move to the next church. He was given a going away party. It was, and there were people in the church knew, because even though the elders were the only ones initially who were aware, as you can imagine, I'm sure they told their wives and their wives told their friend. And so some people in church were very much aware of the situation. And I was looked at as the person to blame. I was absolutely, very few people supported me in the church who knew. At any rate, he was then moved to the next church. And shortly after that, I was called in by the elders and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And this is probably the only part of my story where I get really emotional, because I loved that church. It was my whole life. And being told that I wasn't fit to worship there was devastating to me. And so I left, and that became my down spiral of my loss of my spiritual life and my church life. And it was one of the things that kept me silent for 27 years, because I can remember thinking, if my friends knew I'd been kicked out of a church, I mean, how bad do you have to be kicked out of a church? Who wants that to be known about them? And I believed it. That was the other thing. I believed that I wasn't fit to be in a church. I had such low self-esteem after this, and didn't believe I was worthy of not only being loved, but worthy of being in a church. And that's how I felt for 27 years.
I just want to go back, because you were so involved in the church.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't just a church. It was truly your home.
It
And one of
was.
the reasons why you got involved in the first place, you were kind of a little bit lost after your parents' divorce. And I think that's probably another thing that the pastor picked up on, was your need and your want to belong to something. And I mean, you were there constantly. You were not only the youth, director for a long time, you went to all the camps. I mean, you were
I was in.
all in.
I was in, and I loved it, and I believed it. I believed the church was a place of a caring God and a place of peace, and his abuse stripped all those beliefs away from me. That moment of sex with me took away what I was always thought and I knew to be true was no longer true. And I talk about the chapter in my book of spiritual wounds, of what it not only did to me then, but how it affected my spiritual life for the next 27 years. And even to this day, I have trigger factors when I'm in church. It's better. And I can pray now. I didn't pray for 27 years. I was someone who led prayer breakfast. I was someone who talked about how wonderful prayer was and what it meant in my life. And for 27 years, I never opened my Bible and I never prayed. And I mourned that loss because it was something that was so important to me at one time.
Well, you even said in the book, you described how you never prayed with your children.
And that was very, very sad to me to know that my children never had a bedtime prayer with their mother. I mean, that's a moment that many mothers share in a special time. And my children didn't have that. It was very sad. So that was, so that it ended it. So that was where it ended. He continued, after he left, he continued to call. He continued to insist that I come see him, which I did a couple of times after that. But being away from him, it began then. I was beginning to move away from him in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense as well. And so I began to get my life back a little bit. And that was probably the start, the fact that he was physically away from me. I don't know that I could have ever gotten away from him if he hadn't been physically away from me.
I still keep thinking of those elders, and I just wish I could go back in time and take a baseball bat to their heads. I mean, who does that? Who behaves this way?
Part of that is, and this is not an excuse, but part of it is they're feeling that they have to protect the church. And so it's easier to blame the victim than it is to put the true blame on the abuser. And part of that has to do with the fact that this is a man that baptized their children. He married them. He sat and counseled with them. He helped them when their mother was dying at their bedside. All of those emotions play into being unable to discipline one of their own. And that's why I say to churches and encourage them, you need to get outside help. You cannot deal with this within your own. And that's why the Catholic Church had so many problems and issues, because they dealt with it within the church and they all did their own thing as to how they felt it should be handled. And most of the time it was to cover it up. Which is the worst thing that can be done. And I tell churches too, I said, you're not faulted for the fact that you have an abuser in your church. You're faulted for how you handle that. He needs to be removed and the support needs to go to the victim. Anytime you're in a profession where you're in a helping profession, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, a psychiatrist, a clergy person, your responsibility is to help that person. And when you don't follow your ethics of your profession, you're removed from it. That's the end of it. You've proven that you're not capable of being in that profession by taking advantage of someone under your care. And it's always someone vulnerable, whether it's the age, whether it's someone going through a divorce and a crisis in their life, they've lost a spouse, they're in a vulnerable emotional position. And the duty of that person is to help them and guide them, not take advantage of that vulnerability.
Well, and I like to think that, yes, these people are removed from their positions, but as we all know, in reality, most of the time, their fellow professionals just, keep it quiet, cover it up. They don't want to have the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, whatever it is, they want to be able to protect their own. And that happens all the time, which I think is why it's so important, the work that you're doing now as an advocate, and even just coming out and telling your story. And I can't even imagine how difficult it was the first couple of times to tell the story. I read it in the book, but, reading it and knowing what you were going through are two different things. So tell us what happened after 27 years.
So 27 years, I did marry and meet my husband, married my husband. We have two wonderful children, and life seemed perfect, except I was hiding this secret. And I will tell you, I feared all the time someone was going to find out, or what would I do if I'd run into somebody from the church, which happened several times, and I'd think, oh, they know, and they're going to tell someone. Trauma not only affects your ability to think clearly at the time the abuse happens, but it affects your ability to think clearly even years later.
Right.
I mean, my husband loved me dearly, and I had no fear. I should have had no fear that if he were to learn this about me, it wouldn't have changed anything. But I could not process that. I still had the fear. What if, what would he do? And I could not take his rejection. And so I kept that secret from him and all of my friends. And for 27 years, that secret controlled me. I mean, many ways I thought I was controlling the secret, but it was controlling me because it continually reminded me of that time in my life. So one day I was driving to a golf tournament where my daughter was playing golf in college. It was out of town. And one moment I'm on the expressway and I see the exit sign for the city to which my abuser moved after he left our church. And it just sent a tidal wave of emotions over me. I pulled to the side of the road and I was in a mess. I was an emotional wreck. And I didn't know why, because I thought I've had trigger factors before and I've dealt with them, but this one was a doozy, and I wasn't going to be able to contain it. And it was at that point that I realized something's wrong here. And I wasn't responsible for what he did to me. And I thought I've got to deal with this. And so for about 2 weeks, I kept it to myself until I finally told my best friend, and she was kind and understanding. And that began the process of me eventually being able to tell my husband. I hired a private investigator and found my abuser. He was ministering in a church in Alabama, and I confronted him. And that was very important to me. It didn't accomplish all that I wanted. My expectations were probably too high for what I wanted to hope would happen, but I was glad that I did it. And it was freeing for me to be able to look at him and finally say to him, what you did to me was wrong and you had no right to do it.
That is why I call you the most courageous person I have ever met in my life, because to be able to confront him after all of that and all those years, I couldn't imagine. I mean, it takes an incredible amount of strength and courage and, dare I say the word, faith, but more faith in yourself. I mean,
Right.
You were taking care of yourself as far as giving yourself the opportunity to heal, but to be able to find your voice
Right.
and stand your ground and say that was wrong.
Right. And I had prepared pretty much what I wanted to say to him. But I was so afraid that I'd get into that room and be 16 all over again. And he would be able to control me and manipulate me the way he did, in which he did try. I mean, he went on to explain, he'd been identified as a sexual addict and he had changed and he'd had an alcoholic father and the reason he was the way, and it was all about him. And so I was disappointed. I shouldn't have been, as my husband warned me, don't expect him to understand what he did to you. And that's what I wanted. I wanted him to show me something that said to me, I know what the pain I must have caused. It was never about me. It was always about him. But the courage it took, yes, it did. And I didn't know if I could say everything I wanted to say to him. But I knew that only thing I knew I had to say to him was, what you did to me was wrong and you had no right to do it. And if I could only say that, I was going to feel like I had accomplished what I needed to do.
Well, that's the definition of a true psychopath, isn't it? Somebody who's always playing the victim and manipulation and stuff. But I do want to backtrack way back a little bit more and just interject that you do have a wonderful husband.
I do. Yes, I do.
He is a remarkable man. And so I loved reading about him. So I'm trying to frame even like what was happening there at that time, because even after you left him and after, you at least were able to say your piece and you're moving on, was there any more contact from him? Did he try and contact you? Did he try and explain himself even more? What happened then?
He didn't try to explain himself more. He did contact me, but he contacted me because he was angry that I was continuing to talk about the abuse. because in his words, you said you would try to forgive me. And if you were going to forgive me, you would stop talking about this. Well, that's not what forgiveness is. But he was angry that I was continuing to talk about it. I did try to file a civil suit in the state of Ohio. And so when he got that letter, he called me angry again. He accused me of emotionally blackmailing him, which I found to be just rich. Emotionally blackmailing him. Unbelievable after 5 years of this emotional blackmailing me. But yes, he did try to, but not to try and explain himself. He was angry at me, which demonstrated to me he still didn't get it. He didn't get it.
Once again, he's playing the victim.
Exactly. What are you doing to me? And why are you doing this? And why do you continue to talk about it? He was very angry about that.
Glass houses are just a stone's throw away. That's just rich that once again, he's like, you are blackmailing me, emotionally abusing me. Yeah, it's just amazing. So once this is all done and you've said your piece and you're moving on with your life, how did you get involved with the work that you're doing now? And I really want you to share some of the work that you are doing so we can kind of give some tips or advice or whatever if they suspect something's going on, just something to look out for, a little bit of education here.
So I found on a website the Hope of Survivors Ministry, and I contacted them more to get help for myself. But once I was involved with their ministry, I realized the work that they were doing was very valuable in helping other victims. So I've been a volunteer with the Hope of Survivors since 2005. I speak at their conferences. I help other victims through their ministry. It's a wonderful organization. I would recommend anyone who's interested in this topic to look at their website, because they have an excellent educational part on their website talking about, prevention and what proper response should be once you have found abuse within the church. They also have a pastor's division. So it's anyway, I would recommend looking at their website. The other work that I do is I serve on the Council on Child Abuse on their board, which tries then to work with children and young children to get them to be aware and notice the signs. But also we work with children who will come forward to say, my uncle's done something to me or whatever. So those are the two areas that I have been most involved with. As far as really paying attention, in our churches, because it's the pastor or the rabbi or the priest, we tend to give them an automatic trust that we don't give to other people. So I tell congregations and those that I speak to, if it's a behavior that you might not accept in your neighbor or someone else you might know, then you probably shouldn't accept that behavior in your pastor, your priest, or your rabbi. So in other words, if your priest or your pastor or your rabbi is giving a lingering hug to someone, would that seem unusual to you if it were just your neighbor doing that? So be aware of that. Don't let the fact of their title blind you to the fact that maybe something is not right. Doesn't mean you want to be accusatory, but you just need to be paying more attention that you wouldn't normally do. I also would say that if there's a red flag or something that doesn't seem right, pursue that. There were many red flags in my case, and many people said to me later, I always wondered about that time, or there was one time when he said this to you that I thought that was odd, but no one at that time could think that this was something that would have been wrong. They just couldn't see it because of who he was. And these men are very clever. They not only groom the victim, they're going to groom the congregation because they need their support. And so they ingratiate themselves not only to the victim, but to the entire congregation as well. And then one other thing I would like to be able to say too, is if there are victims listening to me right now, the first thing I want to be able to say to them is it's not your fault. It is not your fault. We as victims carry a tremendous amount of guilt and shame for something we think we should have done or something we should have said. You responded in the way that you could under the circumstances and what coping skills you had at that moment. If you were in an emotional place in your life that you couldn't handle anything, or your age, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, because he was the one responsible for his behavior. He is the one who should have maintained those proper boundaries. So I want to make it clear to victims that carrying that guilt, the guilt belongs squarely on the abuser. And then secondly, I would say educate yourself. Learn the terms of grooming, manipulation, gaslighting, so you can understand what was done to you. Not what happened to you, but was done to you. You were targeted. You were preyed upon by an individual that you should have been able to trust.
Mm-hmm. And that was one thing I did want to bring up is about the grooming process, because it is so subtle, it's so gradual, and it's very insidious.
Yes. Yes, it's methodical. They're and they're patient. Like I said, it took him a year. Someone said to me, I can't believe he was having this kind of sexual, not, overtones with you, but it took him a year before he had sex. And I said, that's also part of their game. They enjoy that grooming process to see how far they can push you. How far will you let them go? And again, that grooming is to create a false sense of a relationship with this person so that you trust them and that you feel dependent upon them because they're helping you. And so, yes, that grooming is it's the first step. And then the manipulation follows. And then the gaslighting, telling you you're crazy. No one's going to believe you if you tell anyone, or, you're too emotional. And that's the reason you're responding the way you are. They change your perception of reality. Your reality becomes the reality they want you to see. So when he would say to me, you're no longer a virgin, no one's going to love you. I began to believe that. And so that became what I believed. And there was no reason for me to ever think I could ever be married and have children.
You mentioned the organization that you were working with, the one that you contacted first.
The Hope of Survivors.
That one, I would love it if you would send me the link to that, and I'll include it with the episode. Okay. And any other resources that you do have, or maybe we'll just direct people to your website.
Yeah, my website has there's a resource page there that has a lot of resources. And then also in the back of my books, there's some great resources as well.
Okay. And the other thing I do want to remind everybody, when you're talking about this relationship and how your pastor was ingratiating himself to all of the members of the congregation, he knew your parents.
Yes. My mother started attending the church, probably in my early teen years. And so she was part of that church, and she loved him and thought he was wonderful. She saw his interest in me as a good thing. This is the 70s, so drugs and free love and all that sex was out there in the 70s. And here was her daughter spending her time in church. So there was no reason for her to suspect anything. She saw his interest in me as a positive, which most parents would see. And he often, would ingratiate my mother as well and joke with her. And she liked him. I mean, as everyone in the church did. He was actually beloved in that church. He could do no wrong. People, so as I said, he was treated like a rock star, and my mother felt the same way.
Oh, God. Now, your mom died young.
Yes. So, she died at age 47.
So she never knew.
Well, she did know, because at one point, after it came out and people were starting to talk in the church, it was decided, he was going to have to address the church. Well, he did it in a very vague way. Nobody really knew what he was talking about. He just talked about how he had sinned in his life and, he was sorry, and that was it. But so it was never anything specific, but people were beginning to get, rumors were starting, and people were questioning things, and why was he leaving? And so at that point, I actually went to him and asked his permission to tell my parents. I would not have told them if I hadn't gotten his permission. The elders had told me not to tell them. So I was, going to behave and obey like I had done for the past 5 years. And I just said to him, I can't let someone else tell them. I need to tell them first. And so I did tell my mom. My stepfather was extremely angry, wanted to kill the guy. My mother, on the other hand, again, because she was torn with this person she thought she knew. And again, I told them I was 20 when it started. So it wasn't like they felt like I was, sexually abused by when I was 16. And I begged them not to make an issue of it, because I didn't want, again, to make it any more worse than it already was. I was still protecting him. Again, I was under his control. I was under this cloud of what he was telling me to say and do. So in my mind, I wanted to protect him as much as anybody else did. And so I begged them not to make an issue of it. And the fact that he was going to be moved to the next church, I think that made my mother feel like, well, he's going to be gone. And again, at that point in her life, in the 70s, it was common to, not to talk about those kinds of things. So,
right.
Let's put it under the rug and let's forget it. Let's move on. It's over kind of thing. And so, and then she did pass away it would have been about 5 years later after that. So yes, she did know. And it would be interesting to see how she would have responded today if we could have that conversation. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for being here. This has been just eye-opening. And I mean, I know, and I read the book, but still hearing your voice and hearing you talk about it, it's just incredible that people can get away with this.
Right. And let me, I will say one more thing, that my former church, I did request a meeting of the current elders of the church to address them as well and to tell them what was done to me was wrong in this church. And they were very gracious and allowed me to meet with them and to get the story straight. I said, I want to tell the truth. And the truth is, this is what happened, not what was told 27 years earlier. And so, that was a huge part of my healing as well, to get a recognition from my former church that, yes, I was welcome back into that church.
Did you go back?
I've gone back a couple times, very difficult. But that's part of my healing, that I need to, that can't be a ghost in my past. I did nothing wrong. I have every right to be back in that church. Yeah. And so for me, it was kind of my way of saying, I'm back here. And for those of you who don't like it, that's okay. It's not a place I'm going to go every Sunday or a place I'm going to look to go to. But I feel comfortable that I can go back there. That,
again, incredible amount of courage to be able to just walk in there.
Yeah, it was. So. Yeah, I will say it was.
Well, okay. So you are the most courageous person I know. So tell us how people can get a hold of you, your website, find the book, anything else.
Well, the book is on Amazon. It's coming out in paperback in the next month or so. Okay. It's my website is just my name, which is Sandy Phillips Kirkham, KIRKHAM.com. It's a website that has a lot of information for victims, for pastors, and my book is also available there as well. Okay.
All right. Any last words, pearls of wisdom, anything you want to share with the audience before we sign off?
Just that I want people to understand it's important that we start talking about this topic more in depth, and that we understand what really is going on with clergy abuse and how it does devastate victims in their spiritual lives. And we need to start getting it right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And people need to be held accountable.
They do. Absolutely. Not only the abuser, but those enablers as well.
Oh, just as much. They are just as guilty.
Yes, if not more so.
Right. Because I think anybody who does not report and they know, right. They are just as responsible, if not more so.
Yep.
Okay. Well, again, thanks, Sandy. I really appreciate you being here. You've been wonderful. You're an amazing guest, an amazing woman. I just really respect and admire you. So you're one of my new heroes.
Oh, thank you. It's been a delight.
Thank you. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you. And get Sandy's book. It's an incredible read. Educate yourself. If you are a victim or somebody who has been victimized, please reach out to them, support them, give them some love. And if you have been on the receiving end, like Sandy said, it is not your fault. Find a way to stand your ground, find your voice, and let the truth be heard. And that is the way of the FemiNinja. And that's a wrap on another episode of the FemiNinja Project. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, be safe, be strong, and until next time, bye now.